So welcome everybody. This is a very special day for several reasons. First of all, this is the beginning of the new academic year. This is strange, but we know already each other. But this is officially the first day of the new academic year. So we decided to have this event and this particular meeting to welcome the new students, in particular the new students for the curriculum in physics education and history of physics. Are here the new people of the curriculum. Welcome, and I also hope there are people who are not able to attend all the lessons because they are workers. So it's also a way to know each other, to have in contact, to create this network, because this is one of the aim of this curriculum and of this activity. So we couldn't have a best way to welcome you, I think, than having here the Professor Sibel Erduran from the University of Oxford for this moment. But before introducing Professor Erduran, I would like to leave the stage to Professor Elisa Polesi, who will welcome you. The Department of Physics and Astronomy, because she's the president of the teaching committee of the Department of Physics.
Thank you, Olivia. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. First of all, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to all the new students, first of all, and to the whole people that are in presence or online. So as Olivia told you, I'm the president of the teaching commission at the department, and so I'm quite a lot busy with dealing with also a lot of administrative staff. And so it's particularly a pleasure for me to be here, not for some administration stuff, but for something which is really an interesting content. And so let me bring you the warmest welcome to all of you, also from the director of the department who could not be here today. Just a couple of words to underline why it's a special occasion for the whole department, not only for you. And the physics education group in the department has been always involved in organizing and leading so many activities. I think since many years, actually, from what I can recall, what I have in my mind since ever, okay? So it's really a long history of very nice and interesting activities. Let me just recall a couple of them. First of all, the physics of education curriculum in our master's degree, which is, I think, almost a unique experience in Italy. It really attracts students from all over the country and a reference of point for the whole community. So we are very pleased to host in our department such an experience. Second, let me recall that the department is very much involved also in the Italian national program that offers classes and laboratory to high school students and also teachers. This is something very important for us because it's connecting the whole university with the world of high schools and teaching. And I'm actually personally involved in one of these labs, and I must say that it's really always very rewarding for us. So I'm very happy about that. Lastly, I would like to recall that very recently, as a department, as the whole department has decided to undertake the organization of some activities that would like to explore innovative practice in education at the university level. That's something quite new for us, and we would really like to explore and try to implement this innovative practice in science classes, in particular for classes for hard science, like physics, okay? So from all this point of view, I think that today's seminar is very important. I think can bring us many new ideas. And for all that, I'm really looking forward to hearing Professor Erduran's point of view. So I again welcome everybody and leave the stage to the others.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elisa. It is really a pleasure to have this research group here in this physics department. This is not we discussed this. This is not all the Department of Physics and Astronomy in Italy have the group of research in physics education. There are some, but this is very important for us to stay in this context and also to combine the different competencies and different interests in the research. Okay. It's time to introduce Professor Sibel Erduran. I'm a little bit moved because really Professor Erduran is one of the most important researchers in our field, in the field of science education research. Now she is a professor in science education at the University of Oxford, and she is also director of research in the Department of Education. She is editor-in-chief in a journal called Science and Education, and also she is editor of another very important journal that is International Journal of Science Education. Science and Education. This is a journal that is very special because it keeps together history, philosophy, sociology, and teaching and science education all together, and discover and analyze the role of history and philosophy for teaching. This is something that is important for us because this curriculum in physics education and history of physics. So this journal is really a journal that keeps together all these different dimensions. And she also served as a president of ESERA. ESERA is the European the European Science Education Research Association, the European Association of the Research in Science Education. And she was elected in Bologna when the conference of ESERA was organized here in 2019. And now also she is a professor also at the University of Oslo, Norway, and in the past she was at the University of Limerick, where she was the director of the EPI-STEM National Center for STEM Education. She also had a lot of important distinguished chair professor position at the National Taiwan Normal University, Taiwan, founded of the Taiwan Global Networking Talent Project, because she really works in collaboration with many scholars all over the world, and she knows very well all the different educational system and the different research in the world. Also, this is a very special competence and knowledge that Professor Erduran has. She also she has a background in chemistry. The master studies were in chemistry, in food chemistry, at the Cornell University in the US, and she had her PhD at also in US at the Vanderbilt University, a PhD in science education and philosophy. But she has also some experience as school teacher, as middle school teacher, and also high school chemistry teacher in the school with British curriculum in Northern Cyprus. So her professional life started from Cyprus, and then she was all over the world. It's really a pleasure to have her here, and I'm sure that you are all very familiar with one of the most important framework about the nature of science that Professor Erduran contributed to build. It is the family resemblance approach. Look at me with smart eyes, okay? And then we will have this Julian here. If I here, so, and this is the title of the course, Science in Physics, Science as a Word for Science Education. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction by Professor Ercolisi and also Professor Olivia Levrini. I think sometimes it's very easy to miss the most obvious thing in a situation, which is that both of my colleagues here spoke in English. And of course, you're an Italian audience. And I know that that's probably partly for my sake, so I really thank you for that. It's important to pay attention to the obvious things that may not be also obvious in other ways if we miss them. I would like to thank the Department of Physics and Astronomy for the kind invitation, and it's really a wonderful opportunity to be here and to be talking to you all. Is the pace of my talk appropriate? Is it all clear? Yes? Because there's nothing worse than talking when no one understands you, because I want to be understood. So at any point in time, so I will be making a presentation, obviously, but if you feel like you don't understand a particular issue or something that I'm talking about, please do raise your hand and ask for clarification. For any substantial questions and answers, we'll wait until the end, okay? But if you have any questions about some lack of clarity for what I'm talking about, do feel free to interrupt me. Because I do care about how you understand what I'm talking about, okay? So today I'm going to be talking about science in pieces and argue for a holistic approach to science in science education. And I will explain what I mean by all of this. But I want to start with a video clip. I'll just show the clip to you. And by the way, welcome to all our contributors, participants online as well. I'm really glad that you could make it, and I hope that you find interesting and useful ideas in the presentation. So let me start with the video. It's about 3 minutes.
Aristotle never imagined photosynthesis. We now know that plants use sunlight to turn carbon dioxide gas from the air into solid material. Excluding water, only a tiny fraction of wood comes from the soil. Photosynthesis is just one of the fundamental scientific ideas that we spend time and money trying to teach. But it seems as though the science isn't being understood. This is the sort of place where you'd expect people to know how trees grow. It's graduation day at MIT, the world-renowned Massachusetts Institute of Technology near Boston.
We are the premier engineering and science institution in the world.
They think that all they've got to do here today is pick up their degrees and kiss a few distant relatives. But a team of researchers from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics is armed with a film crew and intent on spoiling the party. They're here to put the graduates on the spot with some of the most basic scientific questions, such as, where does wood come from?
This is a seed here. You can take it in your hand. Now imagine that we planted that seed, and out of that seed grew a tree. And here, you can take this. Now, what did all that stuff come from?
Nature. In the ground, the soil, the grass, the dirt.
What would you say to someone who told you that the weight of the tree came mostly from the carbon dioxide in the air?
I would say that's very disturbing, and wonder how that could happen.
Came from carbon dioxide from the air? Oops.
It's an interesting idea.
Sounds weird.
Are you surprised
Yeah.
at that idea?
Yep.
That'd be hard to believe because carbon dioxide is, well, it's a gas, and it doesn't seem intuitive that you could add mass taking in a gas.
Uh-huh.
This came from a lot of things.
Watching graduates getting it wrong proved that even after extensive formal teaching, the most basic scientific concepts can fail to take root in students' minds. Matt Schnepp, director of the research group and a PhD in physics himself, admits that the MIT graduates are not alone.
I certainly believe that soil is sucked up through the roots, and I was really surprised when some biologists explained to me, no, it doesn't work that way at all. It's got something to do with the air and so forth, and I could swear I studied this stuff, but it didn't make any sense to me.
Right. Well, photosynthesis is a fairly basic concept in biology. And you might be surprised, you know, this is a physics and astronomy department. Why am I showing you a video clip about photosynthesis? So what? Well, you've seen our colleague at the very end, who was a physicist himself, talking and reflecting about how he himself was surprised about this. Now, we have a problem if this is the case. If people at advanced stages who have been really successful in science have come away from science education with ideas that don't make sense, or they are still confused about those ideas, then we have a problem in education and how we're teaching science. And this isn't just about biology education. There is a whole array of, I'll touch on some of these issues in physics education, chemistry education, practically all aspects of science education. In different domains of science, we see similar patterns in the evidence from research in education. So we see that a lot of students have misconceptions about concepts and like photosynthesis, but I'll show you some physics examples in a minute, but also about how science works. What is science about? There are a lot of misconceptions about how science works. So my screen is covered with the key Italian words that I selected for this. Yours is too, but you know, pieces, pieza, piezi, piezi, and fragmentary, or something like that. Yes, I don't know if you can see it. It's covering my screen here, but the title, you can't see the title of the slide, which is in Italian. Yes, this is my claim to fame in Italian. It's Google Translate. Pieces and fragmentation. Okay. It's probably better to the bottom.
Sono andata sopra, ma non l'ho visto. Questo?
Okay, thank you. So, a lot of students come away from schools with a lot of misconceptions about particular concepts, but also about the nature of science. We tend to do a lot of science lessons in a very fragmented way, and I'll show you some examples of this in a minute. And the curricula themselves present science in a fairly fragmented way. And moreover, there are particular aspects of science that we also exclude. We pretend like they're not there, such as the social dimensions of science or the institutional dimensions of science. So this is a department, it's an institutional setting, a context where scientific research in physics takes place. And that's important to communicate to students, that there is that institutional and the social dimension of science. And then we have mismatch between teachers and the students and the scientists' views of what is a particular notion of science, what is science, and different aspects of science. So in this presentation, I'm going to touch on all of these things. There's a lot of evidence in science education research on all of these aspects. I don't certainly have time to go through in all of them, but I will just give you some very brief examples to convince you that this is a big problem in science education. This pieces and fragmentation in science. So roughly, this is what I mean by science in pieces. Fragmentation of science in different ways. But let's not despair. Let's think about ways of bringing together these fragments. How can we improve science education so that students have a more robust and meaningful understanding of science and more connected understanding of science, so that they don't go away even at advanced stages of education with misconceptions. So something like photosynthesis is taught in secondary schools, lower secondary school. I mean, the people you've seen in the video are graduates from an esteemed institution at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They're science and engineering graduates. I mean, this surely has to make us pause and reflect on how we're doing science education. But I will argue that we have particular methods and mechanisms for connecting and making science education more meaningful. And I will refer to a framework that we've developed, the family resemblance approach, and how we've adopted it for teachers' professional development and to promote students' learning. And I'll show you some empirical work from school-based research that we've done to show you some examples of how we try to promote meaningful learning in science. But of course, these are big agendas. I'm not going to suggest here that we have all the solutions. I'm only going to paint the picture about what are some of the key issues and problems that we have in science education and offer some examples of some of the research that we've done in schools in order to move beyond this problem. Because we can only talk about problems to a certain extent. We need to find solutions to these problems. So as I said, lots of misconceptions in physics. I mean, there are books and articles and a lot of research on this. Like, I don't even have to make a case for this. There are books that have made a case. But some of the ideas about misconceptions are listed here. Heavier objects fall faster than light ones, for example. There are other misconceptions that secondary and also higher education, university students have in physics. There are issues about how students understand in higher education at university level how science works. This has been studied in the context of physics, chemistry, biology. For example, there is research on how there might be confusion about the difference between theories and laws. This is a well-documented finding in the literature. So there's an issue about how we educate students to understand how science works or how nature science works. So there are different aspects to nature of science, and I will mention these. But one aspect is about aims and values that I know some of our colleagues here are very fond of. So so different aspects of science we might be teaching in different in fragmentation and pieces. Okay, so we start this at a young age. So the kids in this picture are very young children. In primary schools, elementary schools, there's a very typical activity that is supposed to teach students variables, variables, dependent variable, independent variable. When you do an experiment, you make a controlled experiment, you change a variable and you keep another constant. So the notion of variables is something that is taught at an early age. And in this activity, the kids are given buttons. Okay, different colors, blue, red, different shapes, round, squarish, oval, big, small. Yeah, so those are the variables, and they're asked to classify them. So they're doing classification on these buttons. Well, my question is, why are they classifying these buttons? Are they preparing for the Milan fashion show? I mean, why? Why would you classify buttons? It's a completely disconnected, decontextualized task. It has no aim or objective in relation to science. It can have an aim and objective for a fashion show because you need to figure out how to, what buttons to use for different dresses, but not, I mean, it has no context of science. And this is one idea of fragmentation. This is a completely decontextualized task. It's a classification task, and they might learn what variables are, but it's a disconnected activity from an actual aim. Because scientists, when they do classification, for example, Darwin classifying organisms, or Mendeleev classifying elements, they have a certain purpose. They want to understand something. If astronomers are classifying galaxies or different types of heavenly bodies, you have a purpose in doing so. So you don't just classify for the sake of understanding variables. So we have a lot of these kinds of activities where the aims and objectives of particular activities disconnected from the actual science. In terms of scientific practices, sometimes in secondary schools, we use particular activities to promote enthusiasm in students. So let's take sweets. Sweets and construct a model of a cell, like here. Why? I mean, it's a fun activity and you can eat it at the end, right? But if it's not a very rich activity in terms of models and modeling. Yes, it is a model of some sort, because a model represents something, right? And you can understand that this sweet represents the nucleus and this sweet represents whatever. However, when scientists do models and modeling, what do they do it for? They do it for explanations and predictions. You're modeling in order to explain a phenomenon or to predict something about a phenomenon. Well, this model will have no explanatory or predictive power. It's simply a fun activity. Now, when you don't connect the practices of science like models and modeling to the actual context of why we do these activities, then again, this is another instance of fragmentation. The activity is not actually related to why we do models and modeling. When we look at curricula, for example, the physics curricula in Italy, and our colleagues, Martina and our team here, they've been engaged in curriculum analysis in physics curricula in Italy. And they can explain the details more later. But my point being here is that even just from that analysis on the right, I'm going to talk about some of the details of these dots, but the dots are basically different aspects of science. So the practices aspects, the methods, the values, the aims and values, methods, the knowledge. So the team has coded the curricula to look at how the different components of the curriculum are tied together. And you can see in the figure there, just by looking at the visual representation, that there are some connections, but there are also a lot of misconnections, which we can then focus on to promote connections so that there is meaningful interactions between the different components of nature of science. I mentioned this earlier. I've had an article in the Science magazine recently where I argued that the social and the institutional dimensions of science are typically underrepresented in the science curriculum. And what I mean by social institutional dimensions isn't that science is situated in some important or relevant social context, which of course we also need to do. However, there is a social and an institutional dimension of science itself. Science does not happen in an abstract world. I mean, artificial intelligence might be beginning to simulate some of those abstractions, but science is done by people, and science is done in institutions like University of Bologna. And there are particular dimensions to doing science that are hardly ever mentioned in science curricula. And I'll show you some examples of this from different curricula. And Martina and colleagues' work in the Italian curriculum demonstrated this trend as well. It's a widespread trend internationally that the social and the institutional dimensions are neglected. So what I mean by that is that the professional activities of scientists, like going to conferences, reviewing papers, developing grant proposals, there are professional activities that scientists do. And I'm not suggesting, obviously, that secondary students will be little scientists doing all of these things, but we can model to them some of these activities so that they begin to understand that science has these kinds of dimensions to it. Scientists, very critically, they review each other's work and they evaluate. If you want to promote a particular idea or report a particular idea in science, what do? You write on a paper, you publish it in an academic journal. And do you just publish it? No, your paper gets sent to reviewers, they evaluate your work, they give you feedback, you have to adapt your paper, all that review processes are things that we can actually get the kids to do in schools or in higher education. You do an experiment and another group of students do another experiment. How do we compare and contrast? How do we resolve any potential disagreements in our results? Scientists have to abide with a certain set of norms. For example, you need to be honest as a scientist. You don't make up data. Yeah, you don't just make it up. You also, there's a certain norm about universality. So I do an experiment in University of Bologna and it only works here. No, it needs to work. I mean, there's a certain sense of universality about the claims that we make in science. I mentioned institutions, science, and science is situated in institutions which imply particular political and financial dynamics. If you want to do science, it costs money because you need to purchase materials. You need to apply for a grant and be successful so you can employ people and buy equipment, buy resources. Well, that's a lot of things for kids to do. Well, I'm not sure. If they're doing a practical experiment, why not give them a little lesson on producing a little budget and a resource list? Because after all, our resources are not finite, are finite. We don't have endless resources. They need to learn that from a young age. So you get the idea. These are the social and the institutional and inherent aspects of science that I'm talking about, that we have often neglected in science education. For example, curricula don't have statements that says, teach students how to review and give feedback to their classmates, or how to produce a budget to do an experiment, or something like that. I know that some of you might already think this is a little too much, and I'll get to it at the end, so hold on to that. But the inclusion of social and institutional dimensions, again, are notoriously underrepresented in the science curricula. We've done a lot of analysis in Taiwan, in Turkey, in Norway, and Italian context. I mean, this is, I know I'm aware of people having done similar analysis in South Africa, for example. The social institutional aspects seem to be underrepresented. But there are some exceptions, like in the Norwegian curriculum, there's a lot of emphasis on social values. And that's partly, I don't know, partly probably about the culture in which the curriculum developers are engaged in, are involved in. But apart from those particular exceptions, mostly the social institutional dimensions of science tend to be ignored. And why does this matter in fragmentation of science? Well, it matters that students are not presented with opportunities to connect what they're learning to the reality of the social context that they're engaged in. I mean, that's a different type of fragmentation, but it is a fragmentation. Because if you don't get a sense that science costs money, and I don't want to just say it's all about money, but there is an aspect to it, or that science happens in institutions, then that's an element that is, it's a missed opportunity for them to understand science in a holistic sense. There's another aspect of a mismatch that I want to mention, which is that if you look at how science is covered in the public domain, and this is an analysis that we've done with one of my doctoral students. I'm not sure how much you can see on the right-hand side, but the different aspects of nature of science, the aims and values, the practices, the knowledge, the political and the economic aspects, which I will review in more detail later. But just to give you an overview now, you see a lot of the four newspapers, top newspapers in the UK, have covered the political aspects of science to a greater extent. Those are the dark cells at the top. So we have the four key top national newspapers covering COVID-19. And we've analyzed articles looking at how they engage with the different aspects of science. And the news media, so science in the public domain, is getting a lot of politics and economics. Those are the dimensions of science that the media is catching on to. So if you're a student and you grew up in a schooling system where there's a lot of emphasis on the knowledge and the methods and things like that, by the time you go out and read newspapers, you won't even realize that there's a social political dimension. So there will be a disconnect between, so there is a disconnect between what the schools and the curricula are doing and how science is represented in the media, which we need to be mindful of. We've done studies where we've compared scientists, teachers, and students' views of the nature of science. And we see a lot of variation here as well, in terms of how the ideas are connected or fragmented. I have papers that I can, if there's a particular element of my presentation that you're interested in, I can provide the references. But here, my only concern in presenting this work is to illustrate what I mean by science fragmentation, science in pieces, and the fragmentation issue. So we see it in different ways in terms of coverage in school activities, coverage in the curricula, coverage in the public domain, and then when we look at the actual people, how they view how science works is quite different. So what do we do? So what do we do? How can science be taught in a more holistic fashion that leads to robust understanding of science? So what I mean by that is, I want an MIT graduate to be able to say, yes, this is the product of photosynthesis. I want them to be able to connect the concept of photosynthesis to the tree that they see outside, because they're not connecting it. Imagine. I'm sure if the question to them was, what is photosynthesis? Tell me the chemical equation of photosynthesis, they would all be writing it down for you. But what good is that if they cannot understand that the tree outside is that process, has undergone that process? So how can we make sure that we have that holistic understanding of science? Well, this was the incentive for our book. That with my colleague Zubayda Dagger, that we published in 2014, so almost 10 years ago now, where we tried to conceptualize science from a holistic point of view. And we characterized nature of science as a cognitive epistemic and a social institutional system. Now that's a very fancy way of saying cognitive. So science has a thinking dimension, thinking, reasoning, that's a cognitive dimension. Epistemic is about the knowledge dimension, the knowledge of explanations, theories, knowledge that we have in science. The social and institutional are some of the things that I've just mentioned. And all of it is science. Science, in fact, is a system. Without any of these components, we don't have science. If we don't have peer review in journals, the social certification and review and evaluation, the social process of evaluation, we don't have robust knowledge in science. So it's not a disconnect from, so social activities are not disconnected really from the other aspects. This is why we view it as a system. So in our framework, we use what's called the family resemblance approach. And what is this approach? Well, this approach was first introduced in the science education literature by Irzik and Nola in 2011, and then subsequently developed a little bit more. They're philosophers of science. And we've taken that framework and extended it further for science education. So it's a fancy term, family resemblance. Resemble means somebody looks like someone else. The family resemblance. So if I scattered these people in these pictures, if they imagine that you were in a crowd and you said, cluster these people into a family, you know, put them into a family, you would start to pay attention to some of their biological features and put them in together. So you would put all the Obamas together and you would put the royal family together and more or less, okay? And the Italian family. I did a Google search on Italian family and that's a photo that I came up. I like it. It's a sepia undertone, nostalgic Italian family. So family resemblance, what's the point? Well, this basically means we take physics, we take chemistry, we take biology, we take earth science, paleontology, and we say they're all science. Why? On what basis do we say they're science? Why don't we put astrology into that? Or, I don't know, aromatherapy or something else, intelligent design. We don't put those things into this family. So science has a family based on resemblances. There are certain characteristics of science that all sciences have that makes that discipline a science. Now, physics is not the same as chemistry, and biology is not the same as chemistry or physics. Some people might have this reductive approach that all of science is physics. Chemistry reduces to physics, biology reduces to chemistry, and chemistry reduces to physics. There was that reductionism argument for a while. But let's not go there. Let's say that there's a family of sciences, and we consider them science because they share certain characteristics. So there are some domain general that all science possess, and then there are some domain specific features. They're specific to sciences. So for example, in astronomy, I mean, I don't know if you guys do experiments in the traditional sense of an experiment, because you can't really manipulate the galaxies and planets. So astronomy is a science that's based on a lot of historical evidence. You're looking at the past. I mean, that was a revelation for me when I first recognized that fact, because my school science certainly didn't bring me to that point. I didn't realize that I wasn't looking at the stars that are right now and right here. It took me a while to recognize that it was history, that we were looking at the past, which is a very different type of orientation to science than, let's say, chemists right now designing an experiment to produce a particular product. And they can manipulate certain variables, increase the gas, decrease the volume, increase the acidity, or whatever, right? So but nevertheless, so different sciences have particular methods and practices that might be specific to them, but they all are confined by particular practices and features. And what are these features? There are different types of features. In our framework, we talked about this family resemblance approach wheel. And so the wheel itself is intentionally a circle to communicate a holistic account. Now, before we get into the details of this, if you look at each of the components, we try to represent the boundaries in dotted lines to indicate that they are porous. So in order to be able to talk about this framework, we need to solidify it and put it on a page, okay? But real science is really complex. So you don't separate the aims and objectives from methods and practices. I mean, they're all interconnected. So if you're following a particular method in physics, it's because you have a certain aim. You're trying to achieve something. So let me just come over here and just for a minute. So aims and values. You're doing a particular investigation in science because you're interested in finding out something. You have an aim, and you carry out certain practices like experiments and observations you use certain methods like hypothesis testing. And why? And all of it results in construction of knowledge. And so the internal part is about the cognitive and epistemic. It's all about the reasoning and thinking and the knowledge generation, knowledge evaluation, all those aspects of knowledge, which are key to science. And all of this is situated in this social institutional context. So there are social values, social certification and dissemination, where scientists review their work and disseminate their work. Activities like conferences, writing, scientists write, even physicists write, writing. Ethos, scientific ethos, again, things like universality of science, drawing out conclusions that are that can be universalized. And all of this happening in institutions and governed by political and financial aspects. So the whole system. So if you have a particular budget on the project, funded project by the, let's say, the European Union, it's going to dictate all of it. You're not going to be able to do everything. I mean, you might be interested in all sorts of things, but you know, some of these social elements will dictate how you frame and what study you conduct in science. So this framework is intended to unite the different aspects of science in a holistic picture so that we can communicate the cognitive, the epistemic, the social, and the institutional dimensions of science together. Now, in our book, I mean, I'm doing a very quick press release of the book, but in the book, there is a chapter on each of these dimensions. And the chapters draw on a lot of research literature in philosophy of science and science education to make a case for this framework. And in each chapter also, you can't see all of this, I know, but we wanted to sort of categorize, synthesize some of the ideas in visual representations, because that's a lot of information and a lot of complex information. So we wanted to bring together some key ideas so that we can use them reasonably for science education. Because it's one thing to read a lot and understand the philosophy and the history of science and how the different dimensions of science work. But then how are we going to jump from that to school science, to designing lessons and curricula and interventions? So for each of the components, we also have visual representations that cluster and categorize and summarize those ideas. Just so that you know, we also, I mean, recently there was a special issue on this topic, which your very own Sarah and colleagues here, our Bologna team also had a paper in on this approach, and there are different aspects of this approach also represented in the special issue, looking at textbooks, curricula, teacher education, teaching and learning, and so on. So I'll give you some examples of how we've tried to adapt this framework in school-based projects to see how we can begin to apply it in teacher education and teaching and learning. Now, linking, I don't want to disconnect in my own presentations or fragmentation. The whole thing, the whole point about this is that the FRA will and the framework itself is holistic and it's not fragmented. Okay, so it's a overview of science as a system, and the important fact is that all those aspects are interconnected. But sometimes when you have to do research to be able to do to understand a particular issue, you might have to disconnect some of these pieces so that you can focus on them. So that's partly because we are not omnipotent and we have to focus on particular aspects. However, I'll show you some examples where we've implemented the entire framework of FRA in secondary pre-service teacher education in Turkey. And the entire approach was implemented there. And so as part of that approach, I'll also focus on the scientific knowledge category to show you. And then I'll also show you some examples of how we've used FRA in service teacher education with secondary teachers in England and also early childhood education teachers in the United Arab Emirates. So this might seem all arbitrary in terms of geographical location, but there are reasons for these connections. And I'll explain to you why as we go along. So one project was this 11-week course in Turkey in a pre-service teacher education program. So this is a program where they're training teachers for secondary schools. And the reason why we could do it in that context, because they have that sort of flexibility. You can actually open up a course, 11-week course. In my own university, it's impossible to do that. The way that teacher education works in England, it's a 1-year course, and it's a very intense course. In the 1 year, the students are in schools most of the time, and so they're in the university for a limited period of time. So it's impossible to do this sort of validation or experimentation project in our context. We've done smaller versions of this in England, but I just wanted to show you a sort of a broad approach to how we've done this. So we've taken the whole FRA framework and designed a pre-service teacher education course. So each of the aspects of the that I've mentioned to you would be covered every week. There are 11 categories, and there would be a separate category every week, something like that. And then in between the sessions, the students would design lesson resources, and at certain times they go into schools and do teaching practice. And this is me teaching. I went over there and I co-taught with my colleague Ebu Kaya. So as far as the teaching went, we did a lot of group work. So a lot of time for consolidating ideas, discussions to understand and to make sense of the ideas. We had presentations, including from ourselves as instructors, but also from the students, from their projects, and a lot of group discussions and group evaluations. So some of the things that I was talking about the social institutional aspects, social certification, dissemination, all those elements, peer review, we've tried to model those in our own teaching for the students to see. So the student teachers to see how we could model those strategies with them. One of the things that we've also done in this project was to develop particular tools like a questionnaire to measure the effectiveness of our intervention. So we had a 70-item questionnaire, and we have applied this questionnaire before and after our implementation, and we've seen significant impact on teachers' understanding of the nature of science following this, having done this analysis. And this was published in a paper in the International Journal of Science Education. Now, within this project, again, you can imagine there was a lot of data. We collected a lot of data from the sessions, from the student teachers, the previous pre-service teachers. And we've published widely about the different aspects, but we decided to just focus on the epistemic core, so the inside of the wheel, the aims and values, practices, knowledge, methods. And so we've ended up writing another book focusing on that aspect. And so that's some of the data and the analysis that we've done are in that book. But let me just give you an example of a task from this project, which is the scientific knowledge task, which in our experience was one of the most challenging one for our students. So in this task, we gave examples of how scientific knowledge is about theories, models, and laws. Now, this is another element of fragmentation in science education. We teach students theories, models, and laws, but not in an interconnected way. And it's important that they understand aspects of knowledge in an interconnected way, because it's the coordination of theories, laws, and explanations that help us understand something. You cannot have, for example, a model that has no coherence with the law. I mean, they need to be coherent. And in our book, in the 2014 book, we had this representation that you can see there. We tried to represent this in a figure where theories, laws, and models are a unit, and they grow with evidence. They grow and they make a whole paradigm, what Thomas Kuhn would call a paradigm. Now, there might come a point when you have to throw away the entire plane and restart. Yeah, in which case you would have a paradigm shift. So these are the sorts of issues that we wanted to communicate about the nature of knowledge to the students. And we gave them examples from the different disciplines. Biology, chemistry, physics, these are the different examples. And this is what a theory is, this is what a law is. And they would come up with other examples themselves, put them in an envelope, and then we would distribute the envelopes to other groups and ask them to classify these concepts into TLM units. And the idea was for them to understand that knowledge in a discipline is structured and it has to be coherent. But this was a very difficult task for them. I mean, I've taught this session, and I mean, among the other sessions, this seemed to be the most challenging one for them. It's a very high level, meta level task. But I want to show you an example, and this is from our book, of what students made of this activity. So before the intervention, we asked them to draw a picture of what they think scientific knowledge is. And on the left-hand side, you can see the student drew a picture of DNA, okay? And then on the right-hand side, they drew a water bath, a cascading bath, like a pool. So before the intervention, and they also explained, we interviewed them. Apart from the drawing, they also talked to us about what they thought. So before the intervention, the student said, when I hear scientific knowledge, I think of proven knowledge, like low quality and high quality knowledge. Simple knowledge can be learned by all. More advanced knowledge is about experts' knowledge. This is the student's conception of scientific knowledge. After the intervention, she says, if we take atomic models as an example, like I said before, I think we can teach about how models, theories, and laws develop when we teach about scientific knowledge. They're not just separately growing in a stepwise fashion, they contribute to each other, and students need to understand that. Now, it could be that the student just memorized that phrase, theories, laws, and models, and just saying it again. But the pictorial representation is really interesting, because what she wrote there is scientific knowledge is like a cascade of water on a water fountain. I mean, this is an abstraction. This is an analogy. It's an analogy about knowledge growth. It's not trivial. The shift from drawing a DNA model to an abstraction like that is a big shift, because now the student is focusing on knowledge growth aspects of scientific knowledge. So it's a shift, and it's a shift that we thought was really interesting in terms of them understanding knowledge, nature of knowledge. So that's the knowledge category, an example that I've given you. Let me just touch on another category, which is about the scientific method. And I'll show you how we've adopted that aspect to teacher education. So there is an assumption usually that scientific method is a linear, stepwise process. So you see a picture, I don't know in Italy if you have posters in classrooms, but in England, in a lot of schools, you would have posters of the scientific method, and it would have something like the one on the picture you see on the right. So it would say purpose, research, hypothesis, experiment, analysis, conclusion. So you have, sometimes it might just be a question. There's some variation of this, but you would usually start with a question or a purpose, and then you do the research, and then you generate a hypothesis, and you do an experiment, you do an analysis, careful analysis, and then you reach the conclusion. No problem. Now, anybody who's done basic research in science knows that that's not how scientific method works. First of all, there isn't just one scientific method. I'll explain what we mean by that. Okay? So it's a mythical method. It's a mythical method. At best, it represents a reconstruction, re-rationalization of the scientific method, not how actually scientists do science. But more importantly, the minute that we give a recipe like this to students, what they take away is what's called the cookbook problem. It's like a recipe. You want to cook some beautiful Italian dish, of course it helps to have a recipe, because otherwise, you know, you can, who knows what ends up coming out of your cooking. But in science, recipe following without understanding doesn't help us. You know, we need the students to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And we need them to understand and to connect the thinking to the doing. So doing these experiments, manipulating the apparatus, doing experiments without understanding, why am I doing this? I mean, the teacher knows, right? But the teacher already knows. The student doesn't know. I mean, from the point of view of the student, they don't know why am I doing this step or the next step. I'm just following the recipe. I need to do some, why? So we have a tendency to sort of teach the scientific methods in a sort of a fragmented manner, fragmentation in terms of the thinking and the doing, and the justification of the methodology from the student's point of view. But there's also an issue with this sort of the traditional scientific method in school science, which is that it prioritizes experimental data over other data. I mean, we've just talked about historical. There are sciences that use historical data. That's not about experiments. And this is why sometimes we have people who say they don't agree with evolution. Well, I mean, it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree. It's a theory that has garnered a lot of evidence because they don't understand how data interpretation works in that domain of science. Okay. Now we found a framework from a philosopher of science called Brandon. And his framework was about the scientific method. And this is like a 4x4 table. And the experimental method is like the first cell. So an experiment is when you manipulate variables and you have a hypothesis and you do an experiment and you manipulate those variables. But not all experiments manipulate variables. You might have a hypothesis and not manipulate variables, or you may have no manipulation at all and no hypothesis at all. Okay, so let me just give you an example from chromatography. So for example, you know, you have a paper chromatography, you have a piece of ink and it separates out into different components of the ink. And so you have a hypothesis about all green, pink ink are composed of blue and yellow pigments. It's separating out. So you might start with a hypothesis and look at the variables and so on. But if you could still manipulate, you could still draw out those variables without a hypothesis. You're just interested in measuring the RF values of like the rate of transmission of the pigment in the water I mean, that's just your entire aim in this investigation. So you don't actually have a hypothesis. Or let's say you find a piece of a drop of blood in a crime scene and you want to understand it. You're not manipulating it. You're testing a hypothesis, but there's nothing to manipulate in terms of variables. You're simply observing and testing a hypothesis. So you're just doing observation, no experimentation. Or you can just be making measurements and observations, and that's it. Like that's just how you're just trying to figure out characteristics of different treatments. And that's a different type of an investigation. So not all investigations in science rely on hypothesis testing or experiments. Some are about observations without hypotheses or with hypotheses. So there's a diversity of methods in science and in the different fields of science. We took this framework and looked at examination questions in England, in chemistry in this case. And in England, there are what are called exam boards. So there are different exam boards who produce the tests that students take. So for example, AQA is an exam board, EdXL is an exam board. These are corporations, they produce the textbooks and their exams, and the students take these exams, and those exams help them to go to university. Their marks help them go to university. So it's very high stakes, you know, your future depends on these results from these exams. So when we looked at 3 different exam boards questions, we saw that there was an unequal representation of the different aspects of methods that are used. So, I mean, just by looking at the graph, you see the yellow part is overrepresented, and that's non-manipulative parameter measurement. I mean, one of the categories. And then there's variation, and there's some of the aspects are missing. The point, if you're interested, there's another paper on this if you wanted to look at the details. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that exam questions are not representing scientific methods in the same way. So the students are not being asked the same type of questions across 3 exam boards. I mean, that's something that's really serious, because there's just unequal representation of the different types of questions that are being asked. So what then? I mean, we can then learn and inform exam boards that there might be an issue here for a better representation of different types of examinations. The other aspect of this is that teachers typically teach to the test because they want their students to do well on the exams. So if you take an exam board paper from previous years, and they only have examples of manipulative parameter measurement and non-manipulative parameter measurement, like exam board has only parameter measurement type questions, it means that that's what the students will be geared towards learning, and less of the other types of exam questions on other types of methods. So unequal representation of diversity of methods. So we thought, let's take on this issue and work with teachers and examiners to deal with it. So first of all, we wanted to emphasize that there is a diversity of methods. There are different types of methods in science. We wanted to link the pieces of the doing and the thinking. So when I do an experiment, I know that this is about hypothesis testing. Oh, this is about observation. I'm not manipulating any variables here. I'm conscious of what I'm doing, right? So the doing and the thinking get connected. And we work with teachers and examiners, and we've developed resources. These are all available to download freely online. And this is our professional development resource. We work with teachers as well, and have different sessions how to do this with teachers. First of all, to teach them about the diversity of methods and how to integrate that into their teaching. We also designed some assessments, summative assessments. Again, because teachers will teach to the test. And if we can change assessments, then teachers will aim to teach in a way that will help them, their students in the examinations. So in this case, we've produced 2 sets of assessments in physics, in biology, and in chemistry. These are the some of the examples, and again, you can download these as well, of the physics assessments. So I don't know how much you can see here, but some of the questions, there are marks. So these are sort of written assessments, but we've given them scenarios where they have to consider advantages and disadvantages of particular methods. They need to figure out what is a hypothesis test and what is not. They need to identify variables and what not, and things like that. And there are, in terms of Brandon's matrix, you know, the 4x2x2 table, we've designed assessments for each category of that table. So in each subject as well. We've asked the we interviewed teachers who've used these resources and who've adopted them for their own use. And overwhelmingly, there was a positive response. One of the teachers said, I felt it made the practical work better because it made children think about what they were doing. Another teacher said something like, it gave the students more ownership and also understand what they were doing. So teachers had a positive response. On a small scale of in the cohort of teachers we worked with, about 30 teachers we worked directly in different locations in England. But we've also circulated this resources on a video format and did pre and post questionnaires to evaluate students' understanding of scientific methods. And we've collected data from 152 teachers and almost 1,000 students in England. And these are the kind of demographics of this project. And we did a statistical analysis pre-post, and there was a significant difference in their understanding. Again, this is all, I don't have time to go into the details, but there's a paper, if you're interested, I can share it with you. So this was encouraging. I mean, we did a very specific intervention where we tried to connect the thinking and the doing and diversifying the methodology and dismantling the myth of the traditional scientific method as a linear stepwise process. And this was the outcome from that investigation. In terms of the other indicators of impact on the students, I just wanted to share one quote from a student who said, before I watched all the videos, I thought all scientific investigations require a hypothesis of some sort, which these videos proved in an easy to understand way. Thank you for opening my eyes. So the student was quite appreciative. We've looked at what the students thought about the resources as well. For the most part, they were positive. Some of them didn't like watching the videos. I mean, in this day and age, we were not surprised by that because there's a lot of video watching everyday life for students these days. So seeing more videos probably is a bit of an overkill. But if we were to do this in a classroom situation, obviously they would be doing the investigations themselves. So in terms of this diversity of scientific methods, again, scientific methods is one of the categories of the FRA wheel. As I said before, we've looked at the whole framework together, all the pieces together, but also focused on understanding how the different parts work and how we can promote understanding within the parts. So this was one activity that we've done in early childhood education in the United Arab Emirates for the project that we had there. And this was about baking, which would be something that would be relevant to that age group. But essentially, you have 2 alternative points of view about the methods that you could use for baking a cake and whether measurement is needed or not for a good cake to come out of your baking. And so one character says, let's put exactly 1 teaspoonful of baking powder. The other one says, no, it doesn't matter if it's, I can just put a little bit of it. So they're discussing and debating this, and it kind of opens up an opportunity for students to begin to think about the importance of measurement and methods in science. With their teachers, we've used some questioning to teach them about Brandon's matrix that we've used in England as well. So did I test a hypothesis? Yes or no? Did I change a variable? Yes or no? And this sort of helps you to think through the reasoning processes of the different methods that are used in scientific methods. So all of these tools have given us some ideas about how to do this in early childhood education as well. Another aspect of this project was that with learning with different cohorts of teachers in different countries is very fascinating and enriching as a researcher. But one of the challenges obviously is about adaptation and validation of our analytical tools. So one of the things we did in this project was translate and validate and back translate from English to Arabic and Arabic to English and that sort of thing. So and methodologically speaking, of course, there are lots of exciting challenges in adapting to this line of work internationally. So at this point, I can expect that you might say, all of this is a little too much. I mean, science is so complex. There are all these different aspects to it. Cognitive, epistemic, social, institutional, 11 categories. I mean, how do we do this? Like, it's so much. Well, I mean, what are kids doing in 12 years? I mean, what are we doing exactly in schools all this time that they go to school? Like, let's rethink about what we're doing. And the question isn't about amount, but how to package what we do. How are we packaging what we're doing and making connections for the students to understand what they're doing? So what we've suggested is that you can start with, let's say, aims and values. You build up another category. So the wheel becomes a roadmap. It's like a map. So I'm going to go here first, and then I'm going to link this aspect, aims and values, to the knowledge, and then or maybe practices. And increasingly, I'm going to link all these different aspects together. So you deliberately construct activities that follow and link these different aspects of science. Now you can do this, we call this horizontal articulation. You can, let's say, do this in a series of weeks, series of lessons, or across the whole year. You know, you can deliberately try as a teacher to build up links across these different aspects. But more importantly, we view this as something that has to happen in a connected way at every level of education. So your knowledge grows as you grow as a student, from primary to secondary to tertiary education. But the connections get made at every stage. You're not going to wait until university to make the connections, because guess what? They're not made yet already. It's too much. There's a lot that's missed already, missed opportunities already. So it's important in our view that these connections get made in whichever cognitively appropriate way is possible at every level of education. You might want to downplay some aspects rather than others. That's fine. You may not dedicate lots of lessons onto the financial aspects of science. That's fine. But if the students, can you imagine you come to a university and you've never heard that scientists apply for grants? That's a problem. I mean, there should be some awareness of the totality of science, the whole of science, as students if we intend to get students to understand science meaningfully. And I mean by that, not just the people who are going to be scientists, but a great majority of people who are going to read those newspapers and don't have any understanding whatsoever of what it means to do science or the different aspects of science. So vertical articulation, meaning across each level of education, we need to ensure that this interlinking of the different aspects of science happens, and we build on it as we go along in education. So in conclusion, what I've tried to do is to reflect on how we have a tradition of breaking science into pieces and not connecting the pieces, to the point that the tree outside, the branch is not connected in the minds of MIT graduates to the concept of photosynthesis. Not only that, we distort science by omitting particular elements of science. We don't give students a realistic and a holistic picture of what science is about. So, and reconnecting the pieces for a wholesome exposure, I think, is something that will help students. And we have some preliminary evidence that this sort of course, it's a big agenda. I mean, I'm not saying that this is, we have, I have my live research mapped out here. This is a long-term research agenda to understand how to do this well. And we're looking at pieces of it, of this agenda, to understand how to do it. But I think that if we focus on building meaningful connections across different aspects of science for students at every level of education, then we're likely to have better chance of enthusing students in science, and those who are enthused, like the MIT graduates, having better understanding of science. And I think ultimately this is about justifying, from the students' point of view, not our point of view as lecturers or teachers, students' point of view, how and why is science done? By whom? Who is doing the science? In which context? What's the purpose? And it's all about understanding science as a whole, to understand how we justify and why we justify science and what we do in science, and how scientific ideas are produced. So that's all. Grazie. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments?
You mentioned the shape, the array wheel, and the connections, like the dotted lines within sight. And what about the fact that we have a pretty straightforward way of learning? For example, how we read books, like they obviously are linear, and then we go through them in a linear way. If there's any way of reshaping the path we take to get knowledge, to read and go through a certain subject in a way that is not that linear, which is doesn't really represent the actual way of how things work in the reality and in the social construct that we use.
That's an excellent question, and actually, it's I mean, it's how textbooks are used. You can use a textbook in different ways. You can start to read it from the first word to the last word of a chapter, linear-wise, or you can use a book as a resource to gain information and to make the links yourself. It's a big issue. I mean, so there are colleagues who have looked at textbooks and they've analyzed textbooks for some of these connections, and in the way that the curricula are disconnected, like we've seen examples of, like the Italian curriculum also has some disconnections between the different ideas. The textbooks tend to have those sorts of issues as well. So first of all, so there's a lot of missing links anyway in textbooks. There's evidence of that from different studies. I'm thinking in this special issue, there are a couple of 2 or 3 papers focusing on textbooks, and I would recommend that you read those because they illustrate those kind of missing links. They illustrate what those missing links are. But what your question is it goes even further than that, which is, how do you actually construct through the written language all of this? And this means there's a lot of work to do for textbook revision, actually. And I mean, in the meantime, though, teachers can help fill in the gaps or bridge the gaps or bridge those linear moments in schools. That's as best as I can think of how to address that in a practical way.
You talked about the connection between biology, chemistry, and physics, and other disciplines based on scientific methods. But what about mathematics that develops in another way, because we don't use the database scientific methods? How can we put it in the framework of this science?
Wow.
They have no more, and they are searching for the
Well,
okay.
I
think
yes, that requires a lot of thinking, I have to say. Like, I wouldn't venture to answer it right now because it would mean that I think that the paper by Sarah and colleagues about interdisciplinarity between physics and mathematics is yeah, they have actually they've written a paper on this, the boundary crossing between physics and mathematics, and so there's a whole intellectual agenda there to explore, and I think sort of looking at the details is what matters. And I would first of all just encourage you to read that paper, and yeah.
Also, if I may, also because I think this is something that is specific in our culture, because in our school we teach together math and physics. Typically in UK, in other countries, physics is supposed to be an experimental science, so it is closer to chemistry, biology, and also in the imagination, in the conception of sciences. I mean, in the organization of knowledge in disciplines, there are cultural and country dependent view. So in our case, math and physics are taught together by the same teacher, and so for us this is much more important. And from our analysis, indeed, the family development approach can be also used to model math, can be used even if it is not in the original framework, in the original development of the framework, but it is very natural, not artificial at all from our analysis to combine to Laura can confirm, because this is something we noticed that family development approach was not developed considering mathematics. So we expanded this application also to mathematics, but it was rather easy and also rather efficient to discuss about what is also the domain general and domain specific in combining math and physics and to considering the specificity of the two disciplines. So, but this was not into general also because in Europe and the other countries, typically there is a different organization. Even if the disciplines are the same, but it's taught by different teachers. And
that's interesting, actually. I mean, it's a curriculum. It's how the curriculum is shaping how the domains are considered. Yeah. And in England, we wouldn't necessarily consider. I mean, math would be related to all sciences, generally speaking, but not necessarily in the same way to just to physics. Yeah.
Martha?
Thank you very much. I'm from PER research with the University of Padua. We're also interested in the ways in mathematics and physics. We have worked sort of on the graduate level. So the question is, does this fade when it gets to the undergraduate level? And can you apply this framework?
Yeah, so one of the papers that I cited here in my talk these colleagues have looked at how the university students perceive the nature of science. In this paper, there was they've looked at different subjects perceptions of the nature of science, including social sciences and physical science, physical and natural sciences. So it's certainly relevant to look at university level students. And the pre-service teachers we worked with were university students. They were training to be teachers. They already had a science degree. Yeah. So I can certainly see this happening. The other thing I would say about that is that there was an interesting paper by Mohan and Kelly. They asked the question, nature of science and nature of scientist. And they've done exactly that. And I think Mohan's PhD thesis was about nature of scientists and university level students' research culture and how they develop their understanding of science as a research culture. So I would suggest looking those up. Yeah.
The comments, questions?
Can I ask one question to you? What is one idea that might have surprised you in this talk? Did anything surprise you? Something that you didn't hear before, or something that you were surprised to hear about? Yeah.
I think that this idea of science as fragmented, we feel it when we are in a classroom, when we attend to some courses or even in high school, that we feel that what we are learning is fragmented, but we cannot understand.
Yes.
And now that we are the future teachers, we're more aware that there is something that needs to be linked. We were missing something probably. So it was in a master thesis was on that. Yes, I think that we need to remember is we risk to teach something in a really fragmented way.
Yes.
So,
I mean, we hear students say this a lot, like they get bored and like, why are we doing this, miss? Sir, why do I need to know about photosynthesis? I mean, or whatever, energy or force. I mean, why? Why? Because we're not connecting it to the, aims and objectives, and why are they learning these concepts? I mean, students actually do voice these, they are aware, because it doesn't, again, in my last slide, I said from the students' point of view, all of this is really for the service of the students, for them to construct meaningful understanding. If you already understand something, you understand it, no problem. And some students do. I mean, I'm sure there are also MIT graduates who excel in understanding photosynthesis. Wonderful. But there's also a lot of evidence that shows that it is something that we need to work on.
Again.
Yeah.
I really like the slide with the different size of the array, and since I think that it's very important to think about this wheel as a structure that we have the possibility to fill in with whatever we want. And I mean, it's not important giving a general idea is different to complete all the aspects of, and so the idea of moving from one category to other and give some ideas about that. It's enough to give a holistic vision of science from primary to high school to undergraduate, graduate level, and so on. And I think that is very important because not a lot of effort.
Yeah.
There are some possibilities in this aspect, and I mean I love the idea of a structure, but we can feel it with a lot of
yes,
and with our objectives.
absolutely. And I mean, again, all of this might seem a bit too much, but it doesn't. It's up to the teacher to determine which aspect to emphasize, to what extent, and how much when. I'm not saying in every single lesson do all of this. Of course not. But if in 12 years you've never touched on this one particular aspect and never connected it to a particular aspect of this topic, that's a problem. And I mean, we can talk about this a lot, but some people might argue, well, this is primary school, small children are too young to understand all of this and all of that. Well, I'm not sure about this. The issue really for me is the issue is always about, as educators, finding the appropriate way of teaching that particular issue, not whether or not the students will find it difficult. I mean, even small children ask a lot of why questions. In fact, they ask a lot of why questions. They're very curious. And so the question really is about appropriating the level for them, rather than, of course, you're not going to teach them quantum mechanics in nursery school. Of course not. But some of these aspects can be brought in, geared towards their level. And the wheel itself is just a roadmap. Teachers can take and adopt it and change it. I mean, I'm not saying take this and this blue figure and use it as it is. Teachers can adopt this, change it, change the language if they want, bearing in mind all these different elements to guide them. In a way, I see this as a map. So I'm in Bologna, and I came from where I'm staying to this department today, and I had my map on my phone. And if I didn't have a map, everything is all on a plain field. I have no notion of where anything is in relation to anything else. Good luck to me finding where I am, right? But so the FRA is, I see it as sort of a meta tool like a map. It shows you a roadmap. First of all, it shows you there are these things. There are these different components and elements. And how are we going to get there? How are we going to get here? It becomes a way, a tool for teachers also and curriculum developers to orient and to remember aspects of science to include in education.
This kind of discourse reminds me of something that I've been reading some weeks ago. Something that is called the spiral curriculum.
Yes.
It's like this idea that every kind of topic can be taught at each level of education, and then when you grow up, you can complexify this topic or make the language more structured and go in depth. But you can do like a general view from the beginning and then complexify this view year after year.
Yes, so you're right. So the spiral curriculum, there have been a lot of arguments for the spiral curriculum in doing exactly that sort of thing with concepts. So you take the atomic theory, you start with Dalton, and you build up all the way to Schrödinger and whatever. You increase the complexity, but this is all sort of concept-based. We've typically done it in a conceptual, on the basis of concepts. And what we're saying here is more, it's a bigger issue. Let's think about science in a broader sense and spiral it. Yeah, different aspects of science and spiral it across. But you use a very interesting observation. Yeah.
Maybe even if like you don't use a fire curriculum, even each concept can be viewed with this kind of structure, with the FRA wheel. And I mean, maybe they are similar, but disconnected. You can adopt this kind of view, but not this other things are correct.
So I didn't understand exactly what you meant there. Could you repeat?
Probably they are similar, but they can be used differently. I mean,
Sure.
you can adapt
The
one.
Here is the same concept of dynamics evolution, but it's not just an evolution of the concept, but it's an evolution of the maximum.
It's that plus everything. More. But the thing is, it won't take that much actually to link and situate these examples anyway. It's a packaging issue for me. It's packaging and connecting the pieces and packaging the curriculum in a way. And yes, some of the social institutional aspects are inexistent. Let's infuse them at some point as much as possible, right?
I also heard that it's difficult to have a lot of evidence about the results of using this method, because you have to do a research for a very long period of years. Probably is the same for this, or like using the FRA view.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's a big research agenda. I mean, it's a research agenda to do it, but in terms of a hypothetical case, I can imagine writing curriculum units. I mean, or we've done the teacher education package, 11 weeks of a package of teacher education, where you can do this in teacher education in 11 weeks. But then you're right about the students aspect. It's a whole research agenda to do that.
Suggesting to experiment the group work with peer-to-peer reviews and critical evaluation, and also the idea of learning while learning, and to experiment the scientific way of staying in society and the social institutional dimension. So that was starting with education.
Glad to hear that. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I was wondering each level of awareness as the average researcher about the problem, or in general about those concepts, and if there is any analysis, the things that the students who are at the research level doesn't have a conception about maybe some aspect of the wheel, and if that's the case, which problem can arise in the context of maybe research and national operations. There are problems that arise from maybe analysis, misconception that survive up to the research level.
Yes. So, I mean, nature of science is a topic of research in science education, has been a topic of research for a long time, since at least the 60s. I mean, formally, like people just researching how to teach nature of science, different aspects of science. And there have been different orientations to this. And even to this day, the FRA is not the only framework on nature of science. There are other frameworks. of course, late Norm Lederman was one of the key figures in establishing this area of research in science education. And I mean, I would imagine that there would be some, differences in how people view the nature of science as well. And so there might be some miscommunication and misunderstanding based on whichever aspect of nature of science framework we're coming from. So that's entirely possible. But I see that as part of a health. I don't see it as necessarily, I mean, it becomes an issue if you're working with someone directly on something and then you haven't resolved that tension of disagreement at all. But sometimes it's actually healthy to have disagreements because it helps us grow in research. We may not always agree, but it means that we understand different perspectives. And I think that's a healthy element of a research culture. You don't necessarily all have to agree on the same framework. At least in science education research. I mean, it's a problem if even in frontier physics, you would have alternative theories that people are discussing and disagreeing about, right? So that sort of disagreement, but in natural sciences, physical sciences, obviously there is a sort of an issue about convergence to a particular theory eventually, or something to that effect, because otherwise we're all talking about different, so that universalism idea is important in science. But in science education research, it's a bit more complicated than that.
But also because if I may comment on this, because I think it's a nice point also for our discussion in the they found that science education community is really interdisciplinary, because there are people from different, not only from different sciences, that this is also part of the complexity, because typically when you see science from chemistry, from physics, from biology, there are some similarities, but there are also some differences in the background conception of what the natural science is. But in science education research, there are also people coming from education or pedagogy, and the area of science also tend to be also inclusive for the social sciences, the social sciences. Okay, so it can be a little bit also part of the background discussion. What are the sciences that you want to combine, that you want to include in this discussion about the nature of science? This makes a lot of difference if the kind of knowledge that you have in mind in order to do it. And this also is part of the discussion, it's part of the also of the discussion of the discourse, to think about what are the background of the researchers. This is part of the complexity. And also the interesting part of the research, which is, I mean, we don't want. We know we are all very aware that we are not able to define in a positive way science, but just to find some features to characterize them and to discuss and to talk about the natural science without reducing it into a definition. Okay, so this is another very delicate exercise that has to be considered. Sì? Ciao! Compare Michelangelo.
Significant part of the efforts of teachers will not go to the next class of researchers, but to people that will read the newspaper and discuss in public. So I would like to ask you if you could, let's say, sum up some ideas from your discussion that could be helpful to deal with anti-scientific forces in our society. I think that maybe some ideas that we communicate with science, for instance, should be feel someone to be excluded from this sort of social institution that is science. And for instance, this would lead to anti-scientific feelings.
Yeah.
If you think that there is something cool that would be more directly connected to this kind of issue.
Yeah, so my point about the public aspect was that when we analyzed the top 4 newspapers about their coverage of COVID-19, we saw that there was a lot of emphasis on science and politics of science and economics of science across all the newspapers. I mean, there were variations, but the cognitive and the epistemic elements weren't at the forefront. There was a bit, and this is from a paper. So my comment there was more about how are we expecting students who are public consumers, or the public of today who are past science students, to make sense of this news media about how science is related to the social context. It becomes an issue, especially when there's a life-threatening disease and public health crisis, right? So there's a bit of a disconnect in that sense from how the science media is reporting, how the science media is projecting science and how school science is projecting science. It's that disconnect there between science in the public domain and science in school is like completely reversed in terms of the, like if you transposed the curriculum analyses with the newspaper analysis, they're emphasizing the totally different aspects of science. So this is about the wholesomeness again. So if school science, the media will do whatever it does, but if the school science actually covered a more holistic version of science, then at least you would expect that people would have better consumers of the media coverage of science. That's point 1. Point 2, anti-science, maybe trust in science, all aspects of science that are, I mean, we could do all of these things, right? And still some people may not be convinced. I mean, you can understand in the same way that you understand smoking is bad for you, and you know you might even be a cancer. In fact, when I was at university, I had a professor who was doing cancer research, and he was a chain smoker. You know, I mean, you could be. There's no guarantee that you could teach science in a holistic way, and the future citizens would act and think in a scientific way, and that's a difficult one. I mean, that's a difficult problem for science education. You could, I mean, with the FRA framework, what we're trying to do is at least to analytically point to students that there are different forms of knowledge and different ways of thinking about science, and this is, you put sciences together because of these characteristics, and anything that doesn't have those sense of characteristics, they're not science. But this demarcation problem is a big problem in philosophy of science, as you would know. It has a long history, and but even if you could intellectually understand it, some people might still have anti-science views. And that's, I mean, as educators, all we can do is try to influence science education as best as possible. I don't know how else to deal with that. People will ignore evidence. They will select evidence to use. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it okay?
Yes, sure.
I too appreciate a lot the idea to stress on social and economical dynamics, even with students, Also because as an high school teacher, I see that these kind of questions spontaneously arise from students. So they are involved in a society and they try to live by themselves. On the other hand, I am quite concerned about the time constraint that we have in school and about the idea of science that not only the science teacher, but also the entire community of teachers and a higher level, the institutional communities that provides for school have. Because we can be aware of what we have to teach for science, the array approach. But if other teachers has not this idea, we are always trying to push other subjects, other ideas, and we would not have a really effective way. And I think that this is particularly true in Italy because we have a very deep division between the hard sciences and humanities and social sciences. So it's difficult sometimes to try to communicate. And so I hope, and I would ask you, could we really, will we really succeed in have this kind of approach in our everyday classes without having, how can I say, side eyes from the headmaster or other teachers?
Right. No, it's a very fair point. And so what I've done with the research projects that I touched on a couple of examples to show that if you start changing how things are done, then you start changing things for students and teachers. So this is why we started looking at curricula, and we've changed assessments. We've sort of designed teacher education programs to influence teacher education, for getting the teachers on the same page, examiners to be on the same page in writing tests. But of course, this requires buy-in at a top level because teachers will always be guided by what is expected of them to do. You will be disadvantaged, obviously, if you start doing all sorts of things that are not in the curriculum. And your kids then get disadvantaged for doing those things, right? So, so it is we can only aim to raise awareness of the issues and try to propose some solutions. And it is a long-term agenda. It's a global problem. What you're describing as in the life of a teacher is actually true of many teachers, science teachers in the world, in my experience of working with different teachers in different countries. So that's why curricula become really important, because that's where what gets valued in your teaching. Your curriculum will dictate what you teach. So your head teacher, your principal, is not going to say, what is she doing now, doing this and that, because it will be in the curriculum. It'll be on the test, because it would have been would be accepted. So I think that's one of the aspects of this is obviously, going back to Fedora project, working with policymakers, curriculum developers and policymakers, I think is an assessment people, really important in influencing some of these changes in education. But obviously, as researchers, we also need to do the research to show what is possible to do and what impact this might have on students and teachers. So if we do this training, the teachers change in their understanding, they switch how they're viewing things. So we need evidence to convince the policymakers, because why would they be convinced that this way of doing something is going to be any better, right? So it's a long-term agenda. We're just touching on some aspects, and I wouldn't do things that would be, you know, completely out of the ordinary, obviously, in the school culture, because that is, but then, you know, occasionally a few bits of links here and there, because you're saying the students are already bringing up some of these issues. In the context of your teaching, you know, you could still, I think, try to at least dedicate some time for them to make meaning out of what's going on in the science content.
Yeah, but if I also may add this about the Italian situation about this. This is part of Martina's master thesis, and it's part of the paper. These different diagrams are just related to the first year of a scientific issue, the blue one, and then is the other, the third and fourth year, and then the other, the fifth year. And here you see a lot of disconnection, a lot of fragmentation, but here Professor Erduran didn't show you instead the diagram of the general objectives of the same Italian national indications. Okay? And in the general part, in the general part about the very goals, there are much more, there are a lot of connections, a lot of aims, a lot of, so the issue is that if someone wants to introduce in the classes issues of the nature of science, is because of the curriculum, even if in the specific description of the content, there are a lot of disconnection and it is not clear where the nature of science is. But in the general part, in the goals and the objectives instead, the structure is much more complex than it is in the different. So in this case, the teacher is completely inside the rules of the game, also produced by the minister, okay? The programma is there, okay? Also, and is the really part.
And actually, this is
and also this is very strange because sorry, this is another issue that I learned just working with that. When they talk about curriculum and the syllabus, they talk about something that is very seriously considerable as a curriculum and the syllabus because there are a lot of constraints. Our indications are really free with respect to the other international syllabus and constraints because they have very specific assessment tools. Okay, not just the final examination, but they have agency who produce the exercise and the exam. So for them, the curriculum is really constrained. We are in the land of freedom from this point. And so it's another.
Yes, well, it's good to be in the land of the free. I mean, but the issue of all these connections being made in the introductory parts of a curriculum is actually quite widespread as well. There are other curricula in Taiwan, in Turkey, we've looked at curricula, and all these connections and this holistic image of science is made in the big narrative, and that big narrative. But then when you actually get to the actual teaching, specifications, what are you going to teach? This is what you get.
Yeah.
You know, there's a bit of a disconnect there. So, but I'm hopeful that at least, so the reason why we're doing this is not to blame anybody. It's really for us to understand how we can bring together and solidify these links for more meaningful coverage of science. That's all. And it just gives us specific knowledge about how to do that, because now you can take this and see what are we going to do to link these concepts, these ideas, and so on.
I have what do you think about using of EA in education, of science education?
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence.
On my opinion, it's a very strong tool, for instance, for education of natural science, because it's based on discussion. Because I can chat with this artificial intelligence that it has the whole view of all natural science. So maybe it could be I mean, a teacher himself very I can't see all the science in our world team. I'm a physical me.
I think you've preempted something that I'm working on at the moment, actually. I think there are a lot of issues in relation to how we view science in light of artificial intelligence. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in terms of data management, data analysis and modeling, that and interpretation, which is being done in ways that haven't been possible previously. I mean, just dealing with a large set of data is incredible, really. And I think these advances will impact it already is impacting how science is done. But I think some of these social elements are becoming more and more important also, because you can, I read a paper recently in Nature that was titled, and this is the title, I didn't make it up. It says something like garbage in, garbage out. You know, what you put into AI and what gives back really depends on how humans interpret and do what this stuff. And so it becomes ever more important to establish some, and they have, I mean, I think that there's a group of earth scientists who are doing climate change research, who are establishing ethical conduct and principles for use of data, and not just generally artificial intelligence, but how it can be used for data management in their respective the disciplines that are involved in climate change, because you can actually, the artificial intelligence will only give back to you what you put in. And so if you put in, let's say, biased data, like it will give you biased interpretations, right? So it becomes important that human beings are able to evaluate
evaluate for the students using the artificial intelligence. I mean,
Yes. We are lucky because Professor Erduran arrived yesterday in Bologna, but she will stay here for 2 months as a visiting scholar. So maybe we can think of reorganizing this discussion. We are analyzing some textbook according to the FRA approach. So maybe it could be, maybe we can continue this discussion. And it's really a privilege and honor to have her here, so we can go. I cannot resist to finish by quoting when Professor Erduran was talking, I was thinking about the sense of dialectic of Platone, and the need, the dialectic as the art to pursue the truth, and the need to keep together and to combine the need of splitting the knowledge and the phenomenon and keep it together and to combine it. Because if you don't move to the big eye or to the little eye, if you don't have the big picture, you are also at least to cut the phenomenon not in its joint, in its natural joint, and just like a bad butcher or something. So the holistic view is also important to cut the phenomenon, but in the natural joint in order to investigate it, because it gives the orientation to cut and to separate, and not to produce this linearization or reductionist of hypersimplification that distort science and distort the natural science. And this dynamics, I think, is very important. Let's keep this also into our reflection in this dynamical view between the holistic part and the different part. And the FRA wheel, the FRA wheel is a really nice example of this dynamics of splitting and keeping together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Ogni perché insomma volevamo dare il benvenuto alla professoressa Erduran, ma anche dare il benvenuto al curriculum, quindi ci sarà un piccolo rinfresco di benvenuto oggi nel corridoio dell'informazione della fisica, che è il nostro laboratorio. E poi volevamo approfittare anche dell'occasione, a nome di tutto il curriculum, volevamo ringraziare la professoressa Legrini e la professoressa Erduran, sorry, I switched to Italian, but I will go later. Per insomma, a nome di tutto il curriculum, per il servizio che ha aperto in questi anni all'Università di Bologna, quindi la professoressa Ercolesi, questo curriculum è un unicum, ma anche il settore di ricerca è un unicum, insomma, in Italia, quindi a nome del curriculum abbiamo un piccolissimo pensiero di tutti i passati, presenti e futuri, gli studenti, gli insegnanti che sono passati per il gruppo e tutto il settore di ricerca, per insomma ringraziarla e insegnare proprio il marketing di questa giornata.